Unfortunately, I was reading that, and then I got on a flight, and I just wanted to zone out, so I listened to this one on tape.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you all about it. But the key thing is that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, was something that we wrote because Greg began observing this weird stuff happening in universities in 2014. It all starts in 2014. Most of your listeners have heard about safe spaces, microaggressions, bias response teams, trigger warnings, all that stuff. That stuff didn't exist before 2014. It just begins creeping in then, and then it kind of blows up in 2015. And so our whole book is an exploration of why. Why did this happen? And so to your question about was there an event, our answer is there are 6 different causal threads. There's like all these social trends, some going back to the 80s and 90s, that came together around 2014 so that students are a little different. And then there are certain forces acting on them that are different. And so you get this weird new game. You get this explosive mix. You get some students who are actually very drawn to grievance studies. And so very briefly, it's things like rising political polarization. So left and right never particularly liked each other. But in the 70s and 80s, if you look at surveys done of how much you hate people on the other side, it's not that intense. It begins going up in the 80s, and then especially after 2000, it's going up very steeply. At the same time, university faculty, who've always leaned left throughout the 20th century, but it was only a lean. And in the 90s, it begins shifting much further left, so that now faculties, especially in the social sciences and humanities, are pretty purified. They're overwhelmingly on the left. So you have a more left-leaning university at a time when left-right hostility is getting more and more intense. And so any question that has a political valence, now there's a lot more people who want to do the football game. Not the truth-seeking game, but that we got to defeat the other side. Don't give me nuance. Don't give me data. We know what we believe, and damn it, we're going to, So you got this changing political situation. And then you've got a couple of threads about what we've done to kids. So, and God, this is a whole nother area of conversation for us, but we basically took away free play and gave them social media. The same, basically kids who were born in 1995 and after, Gen Z, they had really different childhoods, and they're not as prepared for conflict and college. We'll get into that later. But you put all these things together, you get kids who are much more anxious and fragile, much more depressed, coming onto campus at a time of much greater political activism. And now these grievance studies ideas about America's a matrix of oppression and look at the world in terms of good versus evil, it's more appealing to them. And it's that minority of students, they're the ones who are initiating a lot of the movements.
It's such a strange time to be on the outside and watch this, because a person like myself is always counted on intellectuals and professors and people like yourself to sort of make sense of things and to reinforce the idea that freedom of speech and free debate are critical aspects to knowledge. And one of the things that's most disturbing when you see in schools is people that are even marginally right-leaning or centrist being called Nazis and being silenced, and they're pulling fire alarms when they're speaking. Even people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who's a feminist, gets shouted down, and people are yelling at her and calling her a fascist. It's just very strange. It's very strange to watch from the outside, and it's also very strange to not see any pushback by the professors. So sitting here and seeing this happen and thinking, well, these poor kids, they're going to have to go into the workplace. They're going to have to, now they're in this very insulated environment. They're going to escape that environment when they graduate, and then they're either going to push this ideology into the workforce, which you do see now.
That's it,
especially with tech
in the
companies.
last year. That's right. That's right. No, that's right. I know it's strange to look at it from the outside, and believe me, it's stranger from the inside. But one thing I can say that might be helpful here is that from the outside, what you see is the news reports. And the news reports are going to be very selective. And so especially what happens is because, universities have always leaned left, and so the right-leaning media have always been suspicious. So the right-leaning media has huge coverage of every little thing. And sometimes it's exaggerated, sometimes it's misinterpreted. For the most time, there was something there. left-leaning media tends to ignore it. And so I go around the country and, people on the right expect that, oh my God, it's chaos and mob violence on campus, which isn't true. That's an exaggeration. And the left is like, problem? What problem? There's nothing changing. And so I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that there's about 4,500 institutions of higher education in this country. Most of them are not selective schools. They'll take anyone who comes. And in those schools, not much is happening. But if you go to the elite liberal arts colleges in the Northeast and the West Coast, then usually something is happening. And so at Heterodox Academy, it's a group that I co-founded of professors that are pushing back. It's bipartisan. We have as many people on the left as on the right. We created a map of where all the shoutdowns have taken place. And they're all right in the Northeast or along the Pacific coast, like from Evergreen down to Berkeley and all that, and then a couple in Chicago. So in most of the country, this stuff is not happening. Most schools, the culture hasn't really changed much. But at the top schools, in general, it has. So that's one thing to just keep in mind. There is a moral panic on the right about this, which doesn't mean that there's not something real. There really is a huge problem, but it's not as pervasive as is sometimes made out to be.
So is it akin to looking at violence in the news media? Like when you read about violence in terms of robberies and murders, in general, you're not going to encounter much in your life. The world is a large place. Yeah. But we concentrate on these really bad moments.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that, except that, one of the reasons that we took free play away from kids is that we were afraid that they'd be abducted. And that that was so rare. But we got a lot of coverage of that in the 80s and 90s. And we changed our behavior because of that. And that was a gross overreaction. The situation on campus is not like that. It's your odds of being nailed are much higher than that. And so, I hear every day, or at least every week, I get an email from a professor who says, I used a metaphor in class and somebody reported me. And and so once this happens to you, you pull back, you change your teaching style. What we're seeing on campus is a spectacular collapse of trust between students and professors. And when we don't trust each other, we can't do our job. We can't risk provoking, being provocative, raising new ideas, raising uncomfortable ideas. We have to play it safe, and then everybody suffers.
Is social media partially to blame? Because
it's huge. Yeah. Social media is a huge part of this problem. So, in a couple ways. So one is the generational thing that we have. Kids born after 1995 got this in middle school. It had a variety of effects on them. So kids coming in are more conversant with call-out culture. And so that's a big part of this. The other thing, though, is that we used to have what you would call a reasonable person standard. So, for Professor, what's one? Oh, so a professor just wrote to me recently. He said he got frustrated while trying to explain something. And he said, shoot me now. And a student was offended by this because are you making fun of people committing suicide? And okay, had she come to him and said, Professor, I know you didn't mean anything, but that was kind of insensitive. Okay, that would have been great. Like, that's the way to handle it. But for this generation, raised with call-out culture and social media, you almost never hear of a student coming to someone else in private because you don't get credit for that.
Yeah.
So you only get credit when you call them out publicly. And so that's why we're all walking on eggshells, because most of our students are great. Most of them are fine. But if I have a class of 300 students, a lecture class, I know that some of them subscribe to this new call-out culture, safetyism, morality. And so if I say one thing, it's not a reasonable person standard. It's a most sensitive person standard. I have to teach to the most sensitive person in the class.
It's also that person has the opportunity to score, right? They throw up that virtue flag, like I've got one on the board here. Look what I did. I nailed the professor on saying shoot me now, and now I'm a hero, and I've made this a safer space for everybody else.
That's right. And so that's really what is messing us up at so many levels of society. And the fact that a lot of these problems, the difficulties of democracy, the rise of authoritarian populism. There are a lot of weird trends that are happening in multiple countries. And I think it's the rise of devices and social media is the main way we can explain why it's so similar across countries.
Do you think that this is is this some sort of a trend that will eventually correct itself when these kids get out into the real world and then go through a whole generation of that, and then people realize the error of their ways and the disastrous results of having these unprepared or emotionally unprepared kids?
No, I'm pretty confident that it will not correct itself. I think that once we understand it, I think there are a variety of things we can do to change it. But I think here's the way to understand it and why it's not going to change itself. So I'm a social psychologist is my main area. But I love all of the social sciences. I love thinking about complex systems, and systems composed of people are really different from systems composed of stars or neutrons or anything else. And so if you have a complex system composed of people, these people are primarily working to increase their prestige. So, I mean, once we have our needs for, food and things like that are set, we're always interacting in ways to make ourselves look good and to protect ourselves from being nailed, or accused of something. So we're always doing reputation management. Now, think about in any group what gives you prestige. And so if you look in a group of teenagers, you might have a group in which it's athletics. And so if that's how you get prestige, then all the kids are going to be working out and training and practicing. And that doesn't hurt anybody. That doesn't impose an external cost on anyone else. But you can have some really sick prestige economies. And so there's an ethnography about an indigenous population in the Philippines by Shelley Rosaldo is the anthropologist. I think it's called Knowledge and Passion, about the Alangud, which is a name for a tribe in the Philippines. And in this tribe, it's a head-hunting tribe. They find people and cut off their heads, not just for fun, for prestige. So in a lot of societies, you have a lot of male initiation. Boys have to do something to become a man. And if the thing you have to do to become a man is you have to cut off someone's head, okay, so that imposes rather a heavy cost on outsiders. All right, so this is a sick culture. This is not one where we can say, oh, well, that's just the way they do things. Okay, This has to stop. And ideally, they would cut off a stranger's head, like they find someone from another tribe or someone, from, a government agency. They'll just cut off his head. But if necessary, if there's a fight or if there's somebody within their larger community, that can also get you points. So this is a really sick culture. Now, call-out culture is not quite that bad, but it's the same logic. Okay, so if you have a group of teenagers or college students who are all struggling for prestige, as we all are, and if you get a subculture in which the way you get prestige is by calling someone out, showing that they're racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, whatever it is, if you can catch them, you get the points. What you're doing here is you're imposing an external cost on others. And that's what makes you so insufferable, because you are playing your game, but I'm paying the cost of your game. And so that, I think, it's hard to – people aren't going to break out of that themselves. But once we understand what's happening, I think in a sense we can all come together and call out culture and say, stop imposing these costs on us.
How are we going to reach those kids if professors are so terrified to speak out and to cause controversy in class, and no one wants to criticize them because if you do, you risk your job, you risk them organizing against you? I mean, how does this shift?
So I'm hopeful that we can shift it because most people hate it. So even the people who do it recognize that they're always on eggshells. They can be next. There's the tendency of people in this culture to, as we say, they eat their own. They eventually turn on each other. And the mental health costs of it, I mean, there are a number of essays that have been written by people who sort of left that. And it sounds miserable to be inside it. You're always, there's no humor. There's no fun. It's always, hyper serious, angry. And so I think if we can raise kids or encourage them to see the games that social media makes them do and give them a vocabulary. I don't know, we should come up with some catchy terms for it, but give them a vocabulary so that they can like, oh, you're a calling outer. I don't know, that's clunky, but we can help them label this behavior.
Mock it.
Yeah, mock it, exactly.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, there's patterns that you see in people that from a distance, like if I look at it, when I look at them objectively, there's like these patterns. I go, oh, that's one of those MAGA guys. He's one of those, he's got an American flag with an eagle in his avatar on Twitter.
Right.
And if you go through his page, it's all like talking great about POTUS and criticizing anyone who talks bad about Trump. It's strange. It's like these patterns of behavior, these predetermined patterns.
Almost like there are stereotypes.
Not just stereotypes, like they've fallen into a well-oiled, slick groove that's very easy to predict. If you are one of those people, it's super easy to predict that you're going to be pro-Second Amendment.
Yep.
It's super easy to predict that you're probably going to be skeptical about climate change. There's all these different things that go along with these patterns of behavior, and you see them on the right, you see them on the left, and it's weird to watch. It's weird to watch on the outside. It's like, well, this is such an easy pattern to slip into.
Yeah. Well, that's right. So there's data from the Pew surveys. They've been measuring attitudes of Americans since the 80s or 90s, but they've been publishing this series on polarization in which they show that in the 90s, if you knew somebody's attitude on, say, gun control, that would only predict their attitude on abortion a certain percent. And a lot of people on the left, let's say, would hold 6 of the 10 leftist attitudes, and same on the right. But gradually, by the time you get to around 2010, it's like if you know one attitude, you know them all. And that's in part just because if you turn up the volume. So we evolved to do us versus them. And the more we see, if it's us, America, versus them, communist Russia or Nazi Germany, well, then we all come together, and that's great for social cohesion and trust. But as that fades away, and as us versus them became increasingly left versus right, and as we lost the liberal Republicans and the conservative Democrats, those used to exist until the 80s or 90s, as we lost them, once it becomes us versus them as left versus right, now if you only hold your team's position on 6 out of 10 items, you're a traitor. And so you better get with the program. And so the pressures for conformity, the pressures to agree with your team on everything have been steadily rising. And that means there's no nuance. And we can't do higher education without nuance. We can't do college without free thinking and the ability to say, well, you know what? Wait a second. Maybe they do have a point on this thing. And that's one of the reasons why it looks so weird from the outside and why it's getting so unpleasant from the inside.
When you're teaching classes and a subject comes up that may be controversial, do you have like this overwhelming feeling that you're treading on dangerous ground?
Yes. Yeah. So I taught Psych 101 at the University of Virginia, and I would take them into sex differences, the origin of sexual orientation. I would even do race differences, and because there was a reasonable person standard, and I trusted my students and they trusted me, and we had a great time, and we covered a lot of stuff. But now, and then I moved to New York University in 2011 when my previous book, The Righteous Mind, came out. And it's not about UVA versus NYU. It's just about the changing time. Now, as I said, I have to teach to the most sensitive students. So I teach a course on business ethics, on professional responsibility, and we have a section on discrimination and employment law. It's important to cover. We have to cover it. MBA students have to know where the lines are, what the law is. And yeah, I'm kind of scared when I teach that because I'd like to get into all sorts of things. I'd like to get into what do numerical disparities mean? If there's a gender difference in the percentage of tech, but not in the percentage of non-tech employees in Silicon Valley, well, what does that mean? I would like to talk about that. But if a single student thinks that I am denying the existence of sexism, they could be offended by that. And in every bathroom at NYU, there's a sign telling them how to report me anonymously. And they put these up in 2016 in response to student requests. And it means that all professors are on notice that they can be reported anonymously at any moment.
By children.
Well, these are, I'm not going to call them children. I mean, my students are MBA students, but the undergrads, they're 17 to 21-year-olds for the undergrads. Yes, that's right.
Barely not children anymore.
That's right.
And there's an incentive to this what we were talking about before. There's this incentive that gives them attention, they get prestige, they get value from it, and this culture encourages these things.
That's right.